Well, springtime in Alberta, and I get excited about camping. I know I'm not the only person here at Grace Point that does, but one of my favorite parts of traveling is that you get to go and try out all the different local foods. And sometimes they can be quite unique as you go to different places. Just in case you've forgotten, traveling is that thing where you go from one place where you live to this place that's somewhere else. And I'm so thankful that our province has a plan for reopening, and as we get closer and closer to normal, whatever that is, trust me, there's going to be more opportunities to travel. So our family, we've been preparing our travel trailer to hopefully hit the road this summer. And I'm getting a bit nostalgic for the tent camping that I did when I was younger. One of the summer camps that I went to, we would spend the entire week backpacking, and so we would take our tents with us from site to site. There were bike trips, and we would go for hikes and even canoeing overnight, and so it was a lot of fun, tremendous adventures, and we got to do all of this with our buddy, our camping buddy, and we shared a tent with them. We stayed next to them when we were biking, when we were hiking, when we were in the canoe together. And so my tent mate, my buddy, he was a bit of an odd duck. He claimed that he only slept once a fortnight. I mean, who even uses that word? Unless today, I guess, that you're talking about a video game. But he was always telling these tall tales as well, and they were kind of entertaining, but he insisted that they were true, and we knew better. Well, we were canoeing downstream, and we managed to get a little too close to an overhanging branch. And my paddlecraft was not what it should have been. And we got tangled up, and the snake drops into the bottom of our canoe. That's right, it had to be snakes. Well, it was just one snake, but I'm terrified of snakes. And so we drift out from the branches, and immediately my buddy, he grabs his knife, and he stabs the snake right between the eyes. And so he then proceeds to hang it on a stick like it's a trophy. He's a bit of an odd duck. But I'm looking at him with this newfound respect. And so the truth be told, it was just a little bull snake. There wasn't much there, but when we got to our destination that evening, my buddy, he begins filleting the snake so that he can roast it over the fire. And before you know it, there's a bit of an argument, because several of the campers, they actually want to have a taste of the snake. And I'm like, gross. But that's where I get drawn into his latest tall tale. I mean, it's all that I could do not to scream and tip our canoe over, but my buddy, he says, well, Weston, he gets the first bite because he helped me catch it. I learned two lessons from that. First, it was a little bit easier to enjoy his tall tales from that point forward. But second, I didn't want to go anywhere near that snake again. And so today we're going to be diving into 1 Peter chapter 3. Now you've heard David had a heart after God's own heart. Well, it comes to compassion. Peter is going to encourage us to have a gut after God's own gut. We've talked about how our rational mind reflects God and helps us to understand Him. And we can consider the passion, the desire that God gives us that helps us to conform to His heart in very poetic terms. But ultimately, God is also looking for more from us in our appetites and our instincts. He wants us to be completely in line with who God is and who we are in Jesus. And so I looked at that snake and I had no appetite for it. And I think sometimes we're the same way when we look at the good things that God offers us. And compassion is one of those things. It needs to be a gut-level instinct for us as followers of Jesus. The mind and heart are important, and we give a lot of thought to that because that's how those things work. But we also need to be asking God to give us a gut like His own gut, not just a reluctant sense of duty. And for the record, bull snake tastes a little bit more like fish than chicken. Just my opinion. So we want a gut after God's own gut. We want compassion to be our gut instinct, not just a reluctant duty. Keep that in mind as we read here in 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll go through verses 1 through 12. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of your hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the women as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him speak peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Verses 1 through 6, Peter talks about the gut instinct of a wife. Now, the rest of us still need to be paying attention. It doesn't matter if you're unmarried or a guy. That connects all of us together. In verse 7, Peter says, likewise. In verse 8, he says, all of you. So pay attention. So why does Peter ask wives to submit to their husbands? Well, if you look at last week's discussion, the answer is Jesus. Our focus is supposed to be on Christ and reflecting to those around us those internal characteristics that we have because of what Christ has done for us, that sacrifice that he has made for us. And so that imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit needs to be evident. Now, in verse 7, Peter says likewise to the husbands. He's tying these concepts together. So as men, how do we demonstrate this same gut instinct of compassion towards our wives? Now, I want you to notice here, Peter never says, and neither does it say anywhere else in the scripture, that husbands ought to dominate their wives or even to have dominion over their wives. Yeah, brothers, a sneak peek here. In 1 Peter 5:3, we understand that we don't lord it over one another, as some people who are not following Jesus have a habit of doing. Now, chances are you have experienced someone at work, maybe a sibling, someone who has lorded it over you, and you know what that feels like. So if you are approaching God in humility, you're going to recognize never once has Jesus, as Lord, used that position to lord himself over us in his perfection, in his humanity, in his divinity even. So we need to follow his example. So and I think a lot of men, like myself, we don't want to dominate anyone, but we just come by it naturally. I think we're a bit dense at times. We don't understand the difference between ourselves and others. And so Peter makes it really clear here for us guys that are a little dense. We can't relate to our wives just as another one of the guys. There are all sorts of ways to read this passage wrong. Peter describes women as the weaker vessel. Now, this has to be understood in the context of Scripture. You look just a few verses beforehand, just a few moments beforehand, and we understand Peter isn't meaning here that women are less than men, that they're more susceptible to sin. It's true that the word weaker is often used to describe our condition in the flesh, but it's also used in several places to describe the weakness that Christ took on so that he could take our place and satisfy God's need for justice. In that sacrifice, he satisfied both God's need for justice and his need for grace. So if we begin to understand the world from God's point of view, we need that same gut instinct, and we see this word weakness. It should be strength that we consider. Look at 2 Corinthians 12:10. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Powerful words from Paul. So even in that same sentence that we were looking at, Peter reminds us that our wives are co-heirs with us, that they are on equal footing with us in receiving God's grace. And I love this final phrase here in verse 7, so that your prayers may not be hindered. It's a very godly way of saying, happy wife, happy life. Why should we seek to understand our wives? It's good and right, yes, but we also want to have peace in our homes. We want to have the ability to pursue God together. So then Peter is building on this foundation, and it's easy to understand, I think, this relationship between husband and wife on a very basic level. And that's how Peter's dealing with this. So he's building this foundation up for us to understand. We see throughout the Bible that the relationship between husband and wife is used as an example for all of us to understand better what it means to follow Jesus. From the very beginning in Genesis 1:1, we see that God exists in community, and because he created us in his image, we weren't complete without that community, which at its most basic initial level was expressed as one man and one woman. He created them, he created us in that way. So on a fundamental level, we understand the community that we have from this concept of marriage. Now, the examples that you may have experienced in your life, they don't need to be perfect for you to understand why we have ideals about marriage. And Peter lays this out here to help us understand that. By that I mean that you might not have a husband or wife, but you do have a mother and a father, and even your mother and father may not have had a great relationship that exemplifies the unity that Peter's talking about here. But in this case, even understanding what they didn't have can help us to have some insight into what Peter is talking about. Now, there's a few different places that Paul really wants husbands and wives to understand the unique aspects of their relationship. But that's not Peter's main point today, though. Peter wants us to understand what it means to be a community following Jesus, how it is that we're supposed to relate to one another. And so if we're going to connect with others who are following Christ or those who are not following Christ yet, well, we have to understand that from the point of view of the love that Jesus has for us, and this is how we treat them then. So Peter starts with this solid foundation, and he works from there, and the real weight of this passage is directed to all of us, unity of mind. That means that we need to think about others. Some translations say harmonious. And I think that does a better job of translating Peter's intent. Peter isn't talking about groupthink here. He's asking us to be a people with a single mind, a common goal in Jesus. We have one purpose. Just like when we sing a song with a harmony, there's many voices, not everyone's singing the melody, but it all fits together so well to tell the same story. Sympathy and brotherly love. We don't forget that others are different. Take time to understand things from where someone else is coming from. And we live in a polarized society today, be it politics or masks or the Flames versus the Oilers rivalry. We need to understand more than just how to disagree well, but how to understand what a reasonable person could actually come to a point of rooting for the Flames. To love someone who comes from a different background, we're going to need sympathy. And finally, we have to have a tender heart and a humble mind. A tender heart seems to imply that there is vulnerability. And at times, vulnerability might be justified because of the trust that you have for the other person. But in my own life, I've found that being vulnerable is easiest because I'm trusting Jesus and I'm following his lead. We need to be following Jesus together. So Peter quotes Psalm 34. Let's go ahead and read Psalm 34, verses 12 through 19. What man is there who desires life and loves many days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. So do you want to live your life to the fullest? To get the marrow out of every moment? Peter says we need to follow Jesus' example. Turn away from evil, pursue peace. Over the last year, I think we've gotten this picture that things aren't always going to be sunshine and roses. There's going to be times when, just like the psalmist says, you're going to cry out for help. You're going to have troubles, and God will hear you. He will take you through those difficulties. But the psalmist doesn't just start there. It's not just about righteousness. It's been a hard season. Are you living right now with a broken heart? Has your spirit been crushed? Jesus is near to you. And the good news for you, the good news for me, is that it's because Jesus is near that we have access to the righteousness that we need. We have only to be humble-minded, not to think more of ourselves than we ought. We need to recognize our need for forgiveness. And no matter how hard we try, righteousness, well, my righteousness is flawed. And it depends on me being a righteous person to have confidence that God will deliver me. I don't have much of a hope there. But because I've asked Jesus to live through me, to teach me to follow him, to give me that gut after God's own gut, God looks at me and he doesn't see my mistakes, my imperfect righteousness. He sees Christ's perfect righteousness. So do you want God to look at you and see Christ's righteousness? You can pray with me right now. God, I recognize that I've made mistakes, that I've done things that I'm not proud of, that separate me from your love. Thank you for sending your Son to die on the cross, to take my place, to help me to do that, so that when you look at me, you would see Jesus. If you prayed that prayer for the first time, or perhaps you've taken a chance to recommit to following Jesus, I want to encourage you to follow Peter's example here and follow Jesus in community. You can reach out to us here at Grace Point. My email is weston@gracepoint.ca. And I would love to help you connect with a local body of believers that are passionate about following Jesus. Now, that community, it's a place where despite our own imperfections, despite the imperfections of others, we seek to live in harmony with one another because we have a single mind, a single goal, to follow Jesus.